Lord Charles Beresford. There are various reasons to talk about him, but the most common one is that he was Fisher's foil. He is the guy who Admiral Lord Fisher, one of the most famous admirals the Royal Navy's ever had, is almost always mentioned with, because he was his famous opponent. So, an interesting question has come up, especially during the live discussion yesterday, about whether or not he was actually a decent naval officer. And this is the thing. He's certainly more comfortable with sailing ships than he is with steamships. But he does seem to learn his trade. And he does know what he's supposed to be doing. But do I consider him an officer who got to Admiral by merit? No. Do I consider him an officer who was worthy of getting further than Admiral? No. To an extent, he is an example of the extremes of a system which does still have a hefty degree of politics and patronage involved in it. All military organizations do. The fact is that a navy is always going to promote the people who have the experience, and you get the experience by being assigned to certain duties, and you get assigned to certain duties by the decisions of your seniors. And whilst we would always love the seniors to be picking people because they honestly think they are the best amongst all their skills for it, in the end, there's always going to be a certain dimension of who is the person they trust the most to do the role. There is almost always going to be an element of, is this someone who we can see doing the role as we would do it? Now, usually, that can be put down to that is sort of described in other ways. That can be described in a lot less flattering ways. But in my experience, people aren't looking for a carbon copy of themselves. They're looking for a spiritual copy of themselves. And that's the thing. Beresford, because of his family's church and titled connections and political connections, has a lot of patronage outside the Navy, which can be useful for the Navy, but also can be problematic. And an officer who gets promoted because of patronage and gets, and more importantly, several very interesting examples of, well, again, if we're being charitable, high-spiritedness ignored due to patronage and due to the system of patronage they've woven themselves into, can become a full-on liability. With Beresford, and in his case, I do have to say I shudder to think what it would have been like had he been in charge of a fleet actually in war. As commander of HMS Condor in the bombardment of Alexandria, and in the first expedition to try and into Egypt and the Sudan, he survives. He does well. With Condor, he does well. Yeah, you can't fault him in terms of getting his ship into the position it was supposed to be in and managing to respond to the scenario. But you can also find some issues with the running of Condor. The fact is, it seems to be a ship which heavily depended upon its NCOs for its efficiency. And he does seem to have a lot of problems with officers who do not have his background. The big problem with Beresford, and this is how I would describe this, the big problem with Beresford is not that the system promotes him. It's going to. But it's that in return, he is even a more extreme version of the system that promotes him. The system is promoting him to an extent based on his background, on his standing, on his connections to the royal family, to the Viceroy of India, thanks to his brother's services, and to the church in Ireland, and the other connections, thanks to his father and his great uncle. It's not necessarily a bad thing, okay? If he's a fine officer and it allows him to get promoted, it's a good thing. If it's just a quiet word in the ears of Admiral, oh, look at him, he's good, and the Admiral looks at him and goes, he is good, and promotes him, that's a good thing. But if you take it that you should only be promoting officers because they come from a noble background, which to an extent there is a large argument that the British Army of this period was, thank goodness for the Corps of Engineers and the Corps of Artillery, which actually had exams. If you have a look at the British Army and who ends up leading a lot of their military operations, there's a reason why those officers come from the engineering and artillery corps. Because those are the corps which actually had exams, as well as the respectable status which the logistics and corps, the forerunners of that, which was supporting it, didn't. So they had the standing, they had the status, and they had the exams. And this meant that they were usually fairly useful officers. If in doubt, find an engineer to run an operation. If in doubt, find an artilleryman. Yes, you still get a large number of generals who come from the landed and noble gentry, but you can then also check out who their second-in-commands and their executive officers and their chiefs of staff, officers who would be filtering their decisions and commands into actual staff procedure. We can also see with the Charge of Light Brigade when that goes wrong. The Royal Navy, because of its various levels of exams and because of the nature of the sea, always being willing to kill anyone that it can, means that it usually has an advantage over the army in such circumstances. In that, A, noble families are less keen to send their eldest sons there. They might lose them. And B, noble families, how do I put this, are less likely to invest all their sons into it. Maybe one son. After all, if you consider Beresford, he's the second eldest son, and he's the only one who goes into the Navy. The youngest decides to go off and become a farmer in Canada. But, and this is the real problem with Beresford, he doesn't just manipulate and abuse the system, he believes the system owes him. When we consider the story of HMS Defence. Okay. I am not going to claim that she is the world's best ship. Not even at the time is she probably the world's best ship. But she's a perfectly fine vessel. She's a perfectly capable vessel for her time. She is built in 1861. By the time he gets aboard her, it's 1863. So she's a couple of years old. She is what we would call an armoured frigate and the lead ship of her class. She is viable. I mean, a smaller, cheaper version of the warrior class is basically what the defences are. It's not brilliant, but it's not bad. And his main complaint about her is that she's slovenly, unhandy, handy tin kettle, which could not sail without steam, which took minutes instead of seconds to cross top gallants. Now, I realise there are problems with steam, and I realise that this is the time when they're developing it. But you would expect, especially a naval officer who have to be technically minded more than others, to actually be going, well, instead of complaining and writing letters of complaint to everyone, to probably be thinking about how to solve the solution. But no, Beresford is very much at a school. There are engineering officers and there are naval officers. And then he, of course, gets into trouble. He gets into debt, gambling with his fellow midshipmen and others. And if we consider what would normally happen to a midshipman in that role, not a good time. And he was serving in the Channel Squadron of the Defence, one of the premier units in the Royal Navy at the time. He gets into debt. His father consults an admiral, Admiral Eden, who then arranges for Beresford's transfer in 1864 to HMS Clio, where Beresford would be the senior midshipman, as it was hoped that would develop his sense of responsibility. It develops his sense of responsibility so much that on the visit in 1865 to the Kingdom of Hawaii, where they were there to escort the Dowager Queen Emma to Panama for a visit to London, she would go to Panama, then cross Panama, and then come to London across the Atlantic. Beresford and a couple of his colleagues, a couple of his midshipmen, those under his command, pull a prank, steal the American wooden eagle from the gate of the legation of the United States Minister to Hawaii, James McBride. This was before America took over Hawaii, and caused a diplomatic incident, which embarrassed his captain, Captain Nicholas Edward Brooke Tooner, and caused a diplomatic incident between Britain and America, and caused completely badly portrayed in the American press. He and the midshipmen have to go back and reassemble it and put it back up and do all the things that's required. They don't do it themselves. They have to take the ship's carpenters team with them to help them because they don't know how to do it. And he survives. Not only does he survive, he's sent to the Sutlej, which is, or Sutlej, or whatever it's called, which is the flagship of the station. He goes, yes, via HMS Tribune, which was commanded by Lord Guilford, and was promoted to sub-lieutenant on his way. So he goes to another ship, which is commanded by someone, let's be honest, Lord Gifford is the Richard Meade, the 4th Earl of Clanwilliam by the end, and he's a gentleman who does get to Admiral of the Fleet. He is a pretty decent naval officer. However, I do sometimes wonder about the promotion of Beresford, because that just seems to be quite so interesting in terms of its speed and the panel involved. But we'll leave that to one side. After Sutlej, he carries on. He goes to Excellent, where he manages to hurt his foot in a gunnery accident while he's trying to dismount it. Not when he's firing, while he's trying to dismount the gun. And then joined HMS Research, which he spent his entire time complaining about. And because he complained so much about Research and how she handles and how she rolls, and yes, she's not an easy ship, but, most of the officers aboard her aren't writing home letters of complaint. They're trying to learn how to better handle her, and she is a lot better than when she first commissioned. He gets promoted to Galatea via Victoria and Albert. This is connections. This is, he's got onto one of the Royal yachts. This is a glowing position. The Royal yachts are where the Royal Navy is supposedly sticking its best and its brightest officers to look after the royal family. But in reality, let's be honest, the Royal Navy tends to stick its noble officers there to rub shoulders with the royal family and keep them happy. It's not a fighting ship. The problem with that, though, is service on such a yacht tends to lead to royal patronage, which can help you get promoted because you rub shoulders with the royal family and you might become friends with them, pen pals, sending them letters. And Beresford already has a habit of sending people letters all the time. After this, well, as said, he goes to Galatea, where he actually returns to Hawaii, renews his acquaintance with the lovely Nancy Sumner, which I'll get into in a second. Galatea is another plum posting. Why? Because it's commanded by Queen Victoria's son, the Duke of Edinburgh, Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh. Of course, whom a future cruiser class will be named after. The one that's coming out on the Tuesday after this in Long Patrol. He is given this other plum posting. He goes around the world with him, pretty much. They go to Japan, they get tattooed together. They, again, as I said, visit the Kingdom of Hawaii. And you start to get the idea that this man leads a charmed life. If any midshipman, I'm not even sure Philip Vian could have survived, and let's be honest, he survived doing a lot of damage to ships. He wrecked a couple of destroyers and ended up with an admiral of the fleet. Beresford manages to survive causing a diplomatic incident, not with the French, but with the Americans, in Hawaii, while he was drunk. In the 1860s Royal Navy. Now, there is part of me which probably should be impressed that in a time where there is a strong teetotalist movement, strong puritanical movement going on in the church, the revival of the church in Britain, and all sorts of things going on, that he manages to survive in his career. Honestly, I'm not sure who's protecting him. But he must be, because if we just go back to the age of sail, when theoretically nobility was even more powerful, if you had done that, you would have probably been languishing as a midshipman for most of the rest of your career. You would not have got handed a promotion to acting sub-lieutenant, and then on a very nice ship, an admiral would have a future soon-to-be admiral, a senior captain, would somehow finagle it, and you manage to pass your lieutenant's exams and get promoted actually to sub-lieutenant, and then get to the as to qualify for a lieutenant's post aboard the flagship of the Pacific Squadron, where he passed his. Basically, what happens is he has a pre-exam aboard the ship commanded by Lord Guildford. He's promoted to acting sub-lieutenant after that exam. Then he does the gunnery. Then he goes to submerge the flagship, and he passes his exam, his final lieutenant's exam. So, on the flagship, with a lot of interesting officers sitting on the panel. And then he goes to excellent, and then he goes... It's a charmed life. Anyway, this is the girl he loved and lost, is what we could describe it as. This is Nancy Sumner, who is a very senior, very important, very noble Hawaiian lady. There would certainly have been advantages to Britain for one of its lords to marry into the Hawaiian nobility. But she turns him down. There is a suggestion that it's due to social and racial differences. I would say it's probably more due to the fact that this is a woman who ends up marrying for love. And while she feels friendship and definitely has a lot of kinship with him, and they seem to maintain a good correspondence for many, many years, and he does seem to genuinely care about her, she does end up marrying her coachman, which suggests to me that she was not looking for a match, she was looking for love. And I would say that would weigh more in her mind, because this is probably going to sound terrible, but there's probably less social differences between her at this time and the British nobility, minor noble, than her and her coachman. That probably that can come across as classist or snobbish, but it's a case of cultural maybe differences, maybe, but I think myself most likely just not love. I'm sorry. Sorry, Beresford. Your connections could get everything you wanted, but couldn't get you that. So he comes back to the UK, and he runs for the Conservative Party for County Waterford. And he starts causing trouble, because this is a lieutenant who has been elected to the House of Commons, and who is critiquing Admiralty policy. At one point, he's threatening to resign his seat because the Admiralty is so upset with him, what he's doing. The Admiralty are threatening to fire him, or, well, basically put him on permanent leave. And if it wasn't for Benjamin Disraeli, who was the Prime Minister at the time, First Earl of Beaconsfield, he would probably have not survived. But Disraeli felt, and this is where one thing, Beresford is lucky. Beresford is lucky in that Disraeli went, well, your seat matters. Not the person who's in the seat. I don't care about that. I care about having that seat. I care about having that, well, your posterior in Parliament and your ability to walk through a door. That's all I really require of my MPs. And you can fulfill those criteria, so I'm going to make sure you survive. But that's pretty much all he wanted for. That's the interesting thing about Beresford. He does almost go a sort of Roman-style career, in that he likes to hop between military service and being an MP. And actually, that probably explains a lot about him. He has an emperor complex. I've been thinking about him for about the last 2-3 weeks, and I've been trying to come up with a phrase to describe it. And this is about the 4th time I've done this recording, and it's as emperor complex. That is how you can best describe it. He sees himself as being the first citizen. I have no doubt that if he had made First Sea Lord, his next thing would have been he had to become Prime Minister. But he insisted, he was obsessed with going tunk, tunk, tunk up the path. And honestly, keeping him from becoming First Sea Lord was probably the thing that saved everyone a lot more trouble. Because if he'd managed to become First Sea Lord and then managed to become Prime Minister, I am fairly certain Beresford would have caused a lot more trouble. And here is an example of what he did in Parliament while he was there. This is his observations on December the 10th of March 1879, which the Royal Navy must have been so happy with him saying, the Admiralty. Lord Charles Beresford, in rising to call attention to the present system of paying off men of war's men into receiving ships, and to suggest barrack accommodation should be provided for men of war men in lieu of receiving ships. It might appear a waste of time to bring forward the subject of building naval barracks when a sum of money was put down in the naval estimates towards the construction of seamen's barracks, but he believed the great importance of getting these barracks finished as soon as possible to be so underestimated that he should like to point out 2 most dangerously weak points in the efficiency of Her Majesty's Navy. So, let's see. This is a problem which the Admiralty has already realised. The Admiralty is already trying to solve. The Admiralty is not solving quickly enough or well enough or in the way that Lord Charles Beresford would like. Lord Charles Beresford at this point is a lieutenant. I'm just imagining a scenario where, well, today, for example, we have a lot of reservists who serve in Parliament, who are both reservists in the armed forces and are members of Parliament. And that's a good thing. I like that. But if Penny Mordaunt, who is probably the most senior naval reservist I know of serving in Parliament, stood up in Parliament and started critiquing naval policy, not privately to the minister, not a discreet discussion in the back rooms, but actually in the chamber, and was going through critiquing naval policy from this perspective of her own service experience, I can imagine there being a lot of problems. It would be considered very partisan, for starters, even if she's a current member of the Conservative Party, so a member of the government. But it would also be considered a bit of an abuse of her position, because she's using her position as an MP to make a case for her professional career, her reserves, her naval service, and that will be considered a problem. Now, she has brought her naval service up into Parliament a couple of times when it has been relevant, and this is why I feel I can make this discussion. But she has never crossed that line of going through and going, well, I'm a naval officer, so this is wrong, and I disagree with this naval policy. Because she's a serving officer, a serving reservist. He's not a reservist. He is a full-time naval officer, theoretically, on sort of half pay at this point, but I'd say sort of half pay. And yet, he is standing up as a member of Parliament and critiquing the Admiralty. And what happens to him? Well, in 1875, he decides, well, he's promoted to commander in 1875. But in 1874, before he's promoted to commander, He's one of the 32 aides chosen to accompany Prince of Wales on a tour of India. This is, of course, the tour where famously the Prince of Wales at the time, and that's the future Edward VII, comes up with the idea of the dinner jacket by cutting off tails off their evening coats. And he's, in fact, serves as aide de camp to the Prince of Wales from 1875 to 1876. In 1878 to 1881, he serves as second in command of the royal yacht HMY Osborne, pictured. Second in command of the royal yacht, which of course gives him great access to the Queen, who had actually objected to his going on the tour with her son because of Beresford's bad reputation. This is the thing. Beresford is a noble with a bad reputation, still he's able to pull the strings dramatically to protect himself. He also managed to get married in this time, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But it's a plum posting, and this is the second royal yacht he served on. Most officers in this period would serve once on a royal yacht. He's been on Victoria and Albert, he's been on Osborne. Admittedly, these are ships which are going to keep as far away from combat as physically possible, which suggests that possibly someone is either trying to preserve him or trying to keep him away from actually having to make a decision. But these things are interesting. HMS Condor is his next employment, and he gets her in 1882. It's kind of good that he does get her, because this is where he makes his public name. He takes part in the bombardment of Alexandria, and pretty much every officer involved is just, supremely promoted by this thing. Oh, wow, yes, we took part in the bombardment of Alexandria. We did really well. And in 1884, he joins the staff of the Gordon Relief Expedition. That's under the command of Garnet Wolseley. And is part of the Naval Brigade in charge of a Garner machine gun, which, when his machine gun jams and he almost gets overrun, he managed to survive. He gets this Punch cartoon made of him after the Alexandria bombardment. He was rather proud of it. But it's a rather interesting cartoon in terms of it being rather on the money for him. He does seem to be led by something. Not necessarily his brain. He returns home. This victory, this great Gordon Relief Expedition, which of course failed, but he returns home from the bombardment, a national name, and he becomes MP for Marylebone East. Yes, he's a Conservative, elected in central London. He's a rare creature by modern standards, but quite common in those times. He actually is re-elected again in 1886, which is rather good, because this means in 1888 he gets to say this. Lord Charles Beresford asked the First Lord of the Admiralty whether, considering the valuable evidence which Captain Hall, the Director of the Naval Intelligence, could give concerning the present organisation for war, he will ensure that Captain Hall can be called before the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the administration of the Navy, whether he is in command of a ship or not. Oh, cute. You have just mentioned Captain Hall to everyone. That's helpful. Made sure you've raised the profile of Captain Hall, and something which the head of naval intelligence really always wants to have raised. The First Lord, Lord George Hamilton, responds to Beresford with, the Royal Commission must necessarily be the only judges of the evidence they require to fulfil the duties imposed on them. and the Admiralty would be glad to assist them in any way they can for obtaining such information. Whoever they call before them, the head of Naval Intelligence Department, is a matter which must entirely be left to their discretion. It's amazing how often Beresford does seem to ask questions in the same way. When he's actually in Parliament. When he's actually in Parliament. Most of the time he seems to vote by proxy. He is very good at voting by proxy. And somehow some things run alongside, like he's a captain in ships in various parts of the world, but seemingly also sort of, still doing the political duties. I don't know. What came next after Marylebone? Well, first of all, 1899 to 1893, he is the captain of HMS Undaunted. Undaunted is, of course, a wonderful-looking cruiser. And I would be proud to call her my ship in this time. She's an Orlando-class armoured cruiser of the Royal Navy. And they were gorgeous ships and really important for the Royal Navy in their period. They're well armed, well balanced, and they were very capable for their size. Undaunted herself carried 2 single 9.2-inch guns, 10 single 6-inch guns, 6 single 6-pounders, that's 57mm Hotchkiss guns, 10 single 3-pounders, that's 47mm Hotchkiss guns, and 6 18-inch torpedo tubes. Had a 10-inch waterline belt as well. She is a gorgeous ship for her time. Now, she is first commissioned under Charles Beresford. This is his first command as a captain. And it's his first command in terms of... It's the ship's first command as well. Literally, he's getting the newest... For his first commission as a captain, he's getting the newest, sweetest cruiser. And he's sent to the Mediterranean Fleet under the command of Sir George Tryon. Whilst there, he's actually promoted to Rear Admiral. And when he's promoted to Rear Admiral, she actually managed to, the ship's navigation officer apparently gives her the wrong order and tells her to turn to port rather than starboard, and that causes an accident. Now, you might wonder why such a noble officer was deployed to the Mediterranean Fleet far away from politics at home when he's so useful in politics. Well, he got married in 1878 and he'd had children. I think possibly twin girls, but not many more children after that. And he and his wife seem to have an interesting relationship. Well, what happens is that by 1891, she catches on in one of his affairs. And the affair she catches the details of, is with Daisy Grenville, the Countess of Warwick, who was also a special friend, or someone for whom Edward VII, at that point Prince of Wales, had special affection for. Anyway, the Countess of Beresford, Lady Beresford, comes into possession of a letter written by the Countess to Lord Beresford. And she lodges the letter with her solicitor, a gentleman called George Lewis, and basically threatened to use this letter to destroy the reputation of the Countess and of her husband if they don't stop their dalliances. The prince tries to intervene to get Louis to destroy the letter. Louis reminds him that whilst it is a monarchy, it's not, the monarchy doesn't have the power to order a solicitor to destroy his client's private property, and no, he wasn't going to do it. The Prince of Wales then retaliates by excluding not his favourite, special friend, not even Lord Charles Beresford, but Lady Charles. Lady Beresford, the wife, the poor woman who's been being cheated on and run around on from his social circle and from social events. Beresford, I'm not sure, suddenly remembers he's his husband or realises that this would be absolute social suicide if the Prince is allowed to do this, because it will make him look many, many times worse than he already is. Extracts a written apology from the Prince over this, getting so angry over his treatment of his wife. Angry over the treatment of his wife, yet he's been cheating on her. Just, and so the Prince ends up writing to Beresford's elder brother, saying that he could never forget and shall never forgive the conduct of his brother and his wife towards me. I have no words. I really have no words. But I will add that he, of course, resigns in 1889 as part of his from MP for Woolwich for part of his campaign to increase naval spending, and is quickly assigned to Undaunted, and he goes off to the Mediterranean. Gets everyone out of the way for these issues. Lets him have some calm down time. And honestly, the Navy was happy to send him off somewhere else, because here is the sort of thing. Mr. Norman from Wolverhampton asks a question. I beg to ask the Secretary to the Admiralty whether he can state the grounds upon which the Admiralty informed the House on 24 June and 9 July 1901 that a letter from the noble Lord Member of for Woolwich, published in a London newspaper, was a private communication not intended for publication, whether before making this statement the Admiralty had made inquiries of the writer, the recipient, or the publisher of the letter, and whether he can now add anything to the replies he made above, upon the above-mentioned occasions. Secretary of the Admiralty, Mr. Arnold Foster. On the 9th of July last, I made a statement referred to with regard to the late letter in question, because I had received a written assurance from the gentleman whom the letter was addressed that he was responsible for its publication. From this statement, the Admiralty just thought assumed the writer was not responsible. I have nothing further to add to the reply that I made on the dates referred to. Charles Beresford. If I may, by the indulgence of the House, be allowed to say so, I think this question requires a little bit more explanation, because it affects my own character as a member of the House, and because it is due to the service which I have the honour to represent, to place the facts rather more fairly before the House. The fact of the matter is that I did write a letter. I ought not to have written this letter. Under the regulations, there is no doubt in the world I ought not to have written it. Therefore, I was responsible to the constituted authorities. The constituted authorities never wrote to me to ask if I had written that letter. If they had, I should have told the truth, and I should have very respectfully submitted to any reprimand or punishment they have thought I ought to have. When I came home the other day, there were some insinuations that another gentleman was responsible for this letter, that he had published a private letter which I had written. I was then on half pay, and I merely took steps to show that I alone was responsible for the letter. If I had written to the authorities before, and while I was on full pay, I think I should have done something very insubordinate. I committed an error against the regulations. It was said I should have written home and told the authorities I had written a letter and that I was responsible. I conceived I ought not to do anything of the sort unless the authorities asked me. There was nothing in my letter which was not of public notoriety. With regards to the strength of the fleet, there was nothing in the letter that I gained in any way through my official position. May I beg leave to say the crimes are of different characters. If a man breaks his leg by 1 hour, it is very different crime from that of a man who hits his officer with a cutlass. I hope the matter will now cease. The whole question is in the hands of the constituted authorities, and I'm prepared to receive a respectful submission any punishment they may choose to award me for not having complied with printer regulations. Yes, this is during his time as MP from in Woolwich after he's when he's returned back. And this is after his return from his trip to China, which I mentioned earlier, which goes on in 1899. He does so many weird things. He does pack a lot into his life. One thing you cannot claim is Beresford is not experienced. Yeah, if you consider he is on his third parliamentary seat when he becomes an admiral, he is, he's rear admiral when he leaves Undaunted. Then he goes to York, which is his second parliamentary or third parliamentary seat, and then he gets to Woolwich, which is his fourth parliamentary seat. He's had real experience as a member of Parliament. He's promoted to Vice Admiral in 1902, and in 1903 resigned from Parliament when he's offered the command of the Channel Fleet. He took up this position in April 1903, hoisting his flag aboard HMS Majestic. While he's in charge of the Channel Fleet, he basically sails around doing a lot of port visits and doing a lot of what we would call as politics. In fact, there's a rather interesting note because while he's in charge of the Channel Fleet, he gets into a lot of troubles with Admiral Scott and a lot of debates with Scott over the operations. For example, Scott felt that they should be doing more exercises, more training. Beresford felt they should be doing more spit and polish. And I have, of course, missed out his meeting of Fisher when he's second in command of the Mediterranean Fleet. But that's because I'm going to be getting to that in the last slide. He is really an interesting officer. When he's given command of the Mediterranean Fleet from 1905 until 1907, that's when Beatty's serving under him, and Beatty considers it. This is Beatty critiquing it as too rigid and discouragement of initiative. Beresford is everything about status, about purpose, and also about what he sees as his rights. And his rights are to become First Sea Lord in his mind. That's what he feels he should be doing. And let's be honest, considering all the way his path has been cleared, he's on his path to First Sea Lord. If there hadn't been a Fisher, there is every chance that Beresford gets to First Sea Lord thanks to his connections. Later on, he of course becomes MP for Portsmouth. He gets so many freaking MP slots. And in this sort of time, he's talking about floating docks. So this interesting addition to debate. They're talking through the floating docks and times, and Lord Charles Beresford asks, what would be approximately the total cost of each of the 2 floating docks now under construction by the contract? What approximate amount would remain to be expended on them after the end of the ensuing financial year? When were the tenders for these docks received? When were they accepted? And whether he adhered to his statement of 5th July 1909 that the docks would be finished in 18 months or 2 years from that date? And if not, what was the reason for the delay? What was the total amount which was estimated would be required for providing accommodation for the floating docks of Portsmouth? And how much was to be expended for this purpose in this year? And this, of course, is asked in March 1910. So, okay. Mr. McKenna. It is undesirable and quite unusual at this stage of the progress of the work to give the information asked for in the first 2 parts of the question. The answer to the third part of the question is on the 19th of October 1909. With regard to the fourth part of the question, provisional acceptance was given by telegram of the 27th of November 1909. It is expected that the docks will be completed about September 1911. The figures asked for in this last part of the question are not available. Lord Charles Beresford, why has the right gentleman put the date later? Mr. McKenna, I'm not aware that I've done so. In answer to the supplementary question, I stated that the work would be completed in from 18 months to 2 years, and that period is included within the dates I've mentioned. Let's be honest, if work starts in November 1909, delivery by November 1911 would be in 2 years. He's not exactly the fastest politician in the world. So Fisher's foil. Well, they really managed to avoid each other, probably good for Beresford's survival and Fisher's blood pressure for most of their careers, until Beresford joins the Mediterranean fleet as Fisher's second in command. Then the gloves are off. They do not have a good relationship at all. There is quotes galore through all the literature, and we could get into that. But honestly, the problem is they are fundamentally two very different philosophies of how the Navy should be run. Fisher is by no means not an egalitarian. He doesn't believe that everyone should have the right to become an officer and all those sort of things. But he does want to open up the officer class. He does want to, as he does with the Fisher and Selborne schemes, when he's second Sea Lord, etc. He does all these works to try and make sure the Navy can recruit from a far wider pool, a far larger pool, in order to get the good quality officers. He's worried about the quality of officers in terms of their ability, more than the quality of officers in terms of their breeding. Beresford, well, he accuses Fisher of being a social climber, but he's a social climber, because let's be honest, he is the second son of a minor lord who thinks he should go on to rule the world. His major problem with Fisher is that Fisher goes to become First Sea Lord. He's making his reforms, he's doing things which are undermining the traditional way of things, but honestly, Beresford can deal with that. It's when Fisher is promoted to Admiral of the Fleet, and that means Beresford is not going to get to become First Sea Lord. And as I was explaining in the live, Fisher becoming Admiral of the Fleet and therefore being able to do a 5-year plus stint as First Sea Lord, is not unusual at this point. He's the third in a row to do this, and in fact, it's quite common. Astley Cooper Key, another admiral who was First Sea Lord for 5 years and 323 days. There was the Honourable Sir Frederick Grey, who was First Sea Lord 1861 to June 1861 to July 1866, 5 years, 28 days. There are precedents of officers being First Sea Lord for roughly 5 years. And there's even one who was 6 years, 197 days, Vice Admiral Sir Charles Adam. And in fact, in the case of Fisher, both his immediate predecessors had been in post for 5 years. Some of the previous ones had been rather shorter, but there was a period where the First Sea Lord would sometimes be changed with the politics of the day. Once you get to what we would call the First Sea Lords proper, rather than the First Naval Lord. So they become First Sea Lords 2 before Fisher. First Sea Lord, well, actually, during Fisher they become First Sea Lord. But really, they've been First Naval Lords before that, but yeah, they've been First Sea Lords from about 1893 in practice of the post. It's not, the name isn't changed, but the practice of, trying to achieve a level of political independence to an extent. That is what Frederick Richards, that is what Walter Kerr had both been in post for. So the only one who's expecting Fisher to not be in post for 5 years plus is Beresford. And Beresford would start a feud which would rip the Navy apart and cause all sorts of untold problems, cause all sorts of untold issues. And what's funny is they agree on certain things. They agree on sailors training. They agree on raising the pay for sailors. They agree on, in many ways, the professionalization of the Navy. What they disagree on fundamentally is whether Fisher should be first Sea Lord, to an extent, whether the Royal Navy should lead technology or let others implement it first and then just use its industrial capacity to outbuild them. So always be playing perpetual catch-up, in a way, but outmoving, and getting rid of the ships on minor stations. And I can, to an extent, Beresford's argument of getting rid of the smaller ships around the world is also that will reduce the admirals. That will reduce the number of admirals in his mind. That will reduce the number of posts for admirals to be, admirals. Because if you don't have as many ships to command, you don't need as many admirals. I know there's a current ongoing debate about sort of numbers of admirals, but in the nicest way, if you're running a project which is multi-billion pounds, or you're at a joint command post, you sometimes need someone who has that level of experience and that level of rank, and that's going to come with an admiral's paycheck and an admiral's rank. Sorry, that does affect things. And honestly, the current strength of the Royal Navy, etc., is not an argument to reduce the number of admirals, it's an argument to increase the number of ships. But with Fisher, with Beresford, they just fundamentally don't get on. Because for Beresford, Fisher is the ultimate example of someone who's not a lord, not a noble, not one of his kind, who's got promoted up. The very same patronage which has helped Fisher get up and has helped Beresford get up, Beresford doesn't like being applied to Fisher because Fisher isn't a lord. Because Beresford sees the patronage as being of worthy as in, you're a noble, you're born to lead. Fisher sees patronage as, you're good at your job, you're born to lead. And that's their fundamental difference. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you found it fun. I'm going to be Sunday's live is going to be done hopefully over hotel Wi-Fi. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, I apologize now, but I'm going to try my best to deliver it. Thank you very much, and I hope you're enjoying the all the videos going on at the moment, and especially the cruiser 2022 year of the cruisers. Hope you're enjoying that. Take care and have a nice day.